Hello everyone, and welcome to the third Codex catch-up for Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. I waited until this point where I'm just beginning the second half of the game, just so that we have a few more things that I could read and we can learn about. So let's see what else we can learn. Armory, the armament of the military garrison or the state of armory of a town's militia: swords, spears, halberds, bows and arrows, crossbows, armor, helmets, and other offensive and defensive weapons, including firearms. In times of danger, it was the duty of all townspeople to join the defense of the town, and for this purpose, the town had an armory with weapons for the inhabitants. Even in times of peace, townspeople were often required to take turns on guard duty. Black Chronicle. Black books, also called pitch books or blood books, held information and records of delinquents and people suspected of capital crimes. The records were kept by the clerk of the municipal court or of the interrogation of the prisoners, sometimes under torture. The oldest preserved black books date from the early 16th century. Devils. Demons, shorts, are mystical and fairy tale inhabitants of hell specific to Slavic cultural context. While in the rest of Europe, people refer to demonic creatures as devils and attribute purely negative intentions to them. In Czech folklore, we lean towards the image of demons as mischievous, malicious, and often foolish beings depicted with goat horns, a tail, and hooves on their feet, subservient to the will of the ruler of hell, Lucifer. Medieval magic thinking attributed various qualities to demons. Many a castle had a notorious gate to hell in its basement. Many a mill or abandoned building served as their abode. Demons smelled bad, caused disturbances, and were blamed for hens not laying eggs, milk souring, and food spoiling. While the church refuted other originally pagan beliefs, it assimilated demons for its purposes, portraying them as tempters and punishment for believers who weren't devout. Execution place. Execution sites were located on hills, crossroads, and outside the city, as they were considered unclean places. These were desolate locations that everyone avoided. No craftsmen wanted to work there for fear of losing their honor. The only person who frequently moved nearby was the executioner, who often lived close to the execution site. Ordinary people visited the execution site only for one purpose: when an execution was taking place. Executions were a popular public spectacle, often attracting the entire town. Capital punishment could only be carried out by certain towns, and not all of them had an executioner. Firearms. Firearms first appeared in Europe in the 14th century and began to see widespread use by the early 15th century. In the Kingdom of Bohemia, they became pivotal during the Hussite Wars. Interestingly, the Hussites influenced the naming of early firearms, which spread worldwide. For example, the English word pistol for the lightest handheld firearm originates from the Czech pistala, originally meaning a pipe or flute. This weapon features a relatively short forged barrel with a socket mounted on a wooden shaft, allowing the shooter to hold it under their arm. The ammunition included solid balls, grape shot, or specifically shaped projectiles that whistled in flight to frighten horses. Gunpowder was poured into the barrel, sealed with wadding, and the projectile was inserted, all then tamped down with a ramrod. It was ignited through a touch hole using a smoldering fuse or a heated piece of iron. Early firearms were highly inaccurate and had a short range, barely a few dozen meters. But even at that distance, they could pierce solid armor. Another popular handheld firearm in Central Europe was the hook gun. It featured a steel or bronze barrel with an average caliber of 20 to 30 millimeters, mounted on a wooden stock. Like the pistola, it had a hook under the muzzle, which allowed the weapon to be braced against the wall, parapet, or edge of a battle wagon during firing, significantly reducing its heavy recoil. For besieging cities or fortresses, much larger and heavier firearms were used, such as wall guns, howitzers, and cannons. Holy Roman Empire. Not only a geographical area of countries following the glory of Rome after its collapse, but also a socio-political power formation with a great symbolic value. It was not a unified state, but a very loose union of many different states. Officially, the empire functioned from 962 until 1806. its size and member states changing frequently. The emperors of the Holy Roman Empire were elected by so-called prince-electors until the 15th century, when the Habsburg dynasty claimed the imperial throne hereditarily. The coronation of an emperor was accompanied by many political struggles, especially on the part of the church, which claimed the so-called investiture for itself and wanted to be indispensable in this activity. Thus, each emperor had to accept his title from the hands of the Pope. The Bohemian Principality became a part of the empire in the early 11th century, but thanks to Przemysl Ottokar I, the Bohemian lands had a special status within the Confederation. The Bohemian monarch was exempt from all obligations to the Holy Roman Empire, except for participation in the councils. The first Bohemian monarch to sit on the imperial throne was Charles IV. Inquisition. The Inquisition, from Latin inquisitio, to search, to inquire, was founded in the 12th century as a response to the massive heretical movement of the Albigensians, Cathars. Originally, it was intended to serve more as a tool to punish and direct the clergy, but later its main mission became the fight against all heretics. It was directly subordinate to the Pope and thus became more or less an independent power. The Inquisition had three main tasks: to search for heretics, to interrogate them, and convict or bring them to repentance, and to refer the unrepentant to the secular authorities for punishment. The incoming inquisitor first reported to the local bishop and then had a solemn mass and ceremonies celebrated, then received reports, denunciations of heresy from the local people. Heretics were given a so-called period of mercy in which they could declare themselves and ask for forgiveness. The inquisitor evaluated the reasonings and became his own process, which was more intended to confirm the accusations rather than objectively examine them. Although in the common consciousness, the Inquisition is mainly associated with cruel practices, fanatical actions, and a great fear of inquisitors, one of the intentions of the Inquisition and its operation was to rationalize and legalize the trial of heretics and to suppress the practice of ordeals. Divine trials. The Inquisition process was thus based primarily on the testimony and interrogation of the accused. The accused, however, had almost no rights and could be subjected to torture. The Inquisitorial trials was conducted in secret, but the proceedings were recorded in writing for the needs of the Inquisition. These records were intended to prevent manipulation of testimonies. Murals. A large part of the population was illiterate during the Middle Ages. Therefore, art was a tool for education and communication among different layers of society. For this reason, preserved works of art are among the best sources of information about the medieval period. Wall paintings, whether sacred or profane, often revealed their very detailed information about the lives of our ancestors. While religious paintings focused primarily on spreading piety and humility towards God, secular painting represented cultural and historical moments of local history. Among the most popular motifs were allegorical scenes from the Bible, images of court life, or knightly legends. And we also encounter portraits of saints, mostly patrons of the given communities or significant clergy. The paintings also include events such as the founding of buildings, coronation of rulers, or the granting of city rights. Figures were most often depicted in contemporary or slightly archaized clothing, even if the scenes depicted were perhaps hundreds of years old. The depicted architecture typically contains characteristic Romanesque or Gothic elements, and it's enriched with a number of symbolic floral and animal motifs. Large-scale murals often came into being with the contribution of multiple artists, whose styles were visibly inspired by the works of contemporary masters of this or that region, as evidenced by similarities in themes as well as the composition or colorfulness of the paintings. Ringen, a type of unarmed combat known as Ringen from the German Ringkunst, means art of wrestling. It's one of the oldest martial systems widespread in medieval Europe. In an effort to defeat the opponent, the wrestler did not rely so much on brute strength as on a combat strategy that used the whole body, aiming to throw the opponent off balance and bring him to the ground. Kicks, holds, and strikes with fists or the edge of a hand were often aimed at the joints, Attacks on the eyes or finger breaking were also not uncommon. Ringen was taught in sword fighting schools where medieval masters placed great emphasis on comprehensive schooling in combat. One of those who wrote extensively about refining Ringen techniques was Johann Lichtenauer? Johannes Lichtenauer, the master of the most prominent sword fighting school of the late Middle Ages located in Nuremberg. Oh my god, sorry. I have to, my cat is messing with stuff. University. One of the oldest universities in Europe was Charles University, founded in 1348 by Charles IV. Students could study at the Faculty of Arts, Theology, Medicine, and later also the Law Faculty. The Faculty of Arts aimed to expand basic church education and teach grammar, rhetoric, dialectics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. By the early 15th century, more than 1,000 students were enrolled, accommodated in collegiate housing known as colleges. 80% of the students at the Prague University came from abroad, particularly from Hungary, Austria, Poland, and Germany. In medieval times, one could graduate from university with a bachelor's, master's, or doctor's degree. The requirement included an oral examination before a committee. Some fields of study took longer than today, up to more than 10 years. Upon passing the final exams, the student received a diploma. Since its inception, the university has been led by a rector and deans of individual faculties, along with the members of university council and numerous instructors, professors, and lecturers. Among its lecturers and prominent figures was Jan Hus, who also held high positions at the university. Watermills. By the end of the 14th century, most rural towns had an average of up to 7 mills. Water-powered mechanisms operated hammers, fulling mills, sawmills, water pumps, bellows and forges and foundries, or devices for breaking hemp. Each mill consisted of 3 parts: the motor, the transmission system, and the working device. The motor was the water wheel, and the transmission system comprised various components that changed the direction of the force, ensuring a smooth transition from the slow rotation of the water wheel to a faster one. The working device varied according to the purpose of the structure. The core of grain mills were the millstones, the stationary lower stone called the bedstone, and the rotating upper stone became called the runner. Grain was ground between these stones. Proper placement was crucial for a mill. The current had to be neither too weak nor too strong, and in our climate, the strength of the river current varied significantly with the seasons. Therefore, the miller also had to build artificial channels and weirs to regulate the flow. Okay, on to characters, and I'm so glad that Jan Žižka is here. One of the most famous and controversial figures in Czech history, the man who became the face of the Hussite uprising. Unfortunately, only the last 6 years of his life are thoroughly documented. We know that he lost an eye in his youth, and that in 1408 Žižka served in the sabotage unit of a certain Matthew, the leader, and made a living as a bandit in the service of various nobles. According to some leading Czech historians, the activities of his band had more of a political than a material character. From existing records, we know that when he was later arrested and sentenced, King Wenceslas IV granted him a pardon. There is a theory that at least part of his activities might have been carried out at the behest of someone from the king's entourage. His most famous historical period follows the outbreak of the Hussite uprising, when he took command of the rebel forces and earned a reputation as a brilliant strategist and an undefeated military leader who led the Hussites from victory to victory. John Sokol of Lamberg, circa 1355 to 28 September 1410. Jan Sokol of Lamberg was a military leader, provincial governor, son of Jaroslav of Ninis, and friend of Radzig Kobyla. He actively participated in the internal disputes of the Luxembourg dynasty, siding with Wenceslas IV. For his loyalty, the king rewarded him with the village of Horky and the castle of Skalitz near Kostelec in Bohemia. In 1404, Jan fought against Sigismund of Luxembourg at Znojmo. As a member of Wenceslas's retinue, he met Jan Žižka in 1409 and went into battle against the Rosenbergs with him. He fought in the Battle of Grunwald. where he sided with the Polish-Lithuanian coalition. After the battle, he was likely poisoned at a feast at the court of Polish king Władysław Jagiello? Awesome, there is one of Catherine. Catherine, the brave and determined helper of Jan Žižka of Trosnov is mostly just a fictional character, although women bearing this name played important roles in Žižka's life. The first Catherine was probably his mother, although this is not certain, as other sources named her Johanna. We know more about the second Catherine in the provincial land registry books, where we learned that Jan Žižka married her and acquired a farm in Sereyov as a dowry. They even had a daughter, although her name is unknown. After Catherine's death, Žižka married yet another Catherine. Again, we do not know anything about her except that Žižka inherited her property after her death. In view of the importance of this name in the life of this great figure of Czech history, we decided to interpret the character of Catherine in our own way. Otto IV von Berghof, 1399 until 1452. Otto IV, called Young Berghof of Trotsky, was a member of the League of Lords and the son of Otto III. He fought against the Hussites and ransacked the Opatovitz monastery. As well as daughters, he had only one son, John II, whose death in 1455, the family died out by the sword. Animal husbandry. In the Middle Ages, a significant portion of people's wealth consisted of livestock: horses, goats, cattle, and poultry. The horse was highly valued, and until the 12th century was kept only for the nobility, for military purposes and light draft work. This changed during the 12th and 13th century, when horses came to be used for transportation and plowing. In Bohemia, horses were shod with horseshoes from 11th and 12th centuries. Until the 13th century, horseshoes were mostly applied only to the front hooves. But later, as horses began to be used for heavy work, all hooves were shod. Almost every serf in the Middle Ages preferred to own a cow rather than a piece of arable land, so even landless peasants had access to food in the form of milk. Interestingly, milk and dairy products were not in high demand during the Middle Ages. This was partly because almost everyone kept a milking cow, but also because reliable methods of preservation were not yet known. Both serfs and the nobility kept sheep, primarily for their wool. The poorest people kept goats for milk and cheese. Pigs grazed in the forest all year round, feeding mainly on beechnuts and acorns. Medieval pigs resembled wild boars and had little in common with today's pink pigs. The most commonly raised poultry were chickens, and only rarely geese or ducks. All livestock grazed freely in the meadows outside the village. Cattle were only stabled in the cottages during the harsh winter, when people sometimes shared the same room with the animals, which also served as a source of heat. Dogs and cats. Throughout the Middle Ages, animals were viewed purely for their utility. This was no different for dogs and cats. Although animals, according to the Church, had souls, these souls were mortal and could not attain salvation, unlike human souls. Thus, animals were considered inferior beings, subordinate to humans. A groundbreaking perspective can be seen in the Ottoman law of 1502, which regulates the use of draft animals and is arguably the first law against animal cruelty. A similar law appeared in Europe appeared only in 1822. The dog in this period served humans for hunting or guarding and could be trained. It is no wonder that among other animals, dogs enjoyed certain privileges. Breeding and crossbreeding of dogs did occur in the Middle Ages, but not nearly to the extent seen a few centuries later, when various domestic, miniature, or narrowly specialized breeds began to emerge. Most medieval breeds were focused solely on hunting and guarding and looked similar to Henry's mutt. The cat, on the other hand, did what it wanted, and perhaps for this reason it was viewed negatively as an embodiment of the devil and was not very popular, as evidenced by surviving illuminations where it often appears more like a demonic creature. Conversely, the situations were entirely different among Muslims. Christian travelers in Arab countries were amazed to find that cats were as beloved there as dogs were in Europe. Folk songs. While medieval church chants solemnly celebrated God and the Holy Trinity, folk songs were inspired by the village year cycle and often accompanied by group dances and musical accompaniment. Homemade musical instruments included bagpipes, drums, horns, and various types of flutes. Wandering minstrels called vagantes carried with them more expensive string instruments such as the psaltery, mandora, or quintern. They were responsible for spreading the playful and satirical vagantes poetry, which was composed by university students from the 13th century. These poems humorously targeted human vices and satirically commented on the sins of church prelates. Songs were passed down orally without knowledge of their authors. Exceptionally, their collection remained in the manuscript Carmina Burana. Hygiene. From the 13th century on, waste was dumped behind dwellings or buried in pits. Toilets consisted of cesspits topped with wooden structures with a seat or just a board. There were water drainage systems and no lack of freestanding latrines and outhouses or at castle privies. It was not uncommon for a latrine to be shared between several dwellings. In inhospitable and badly heated castles, there were sometimes bathrooms with bathtubs or even plunge pools. Bathing was attractive, not just as a means of cleansing the body, but also for pleasure. In private houses, a bathroom was a sign of luxury and high status. This did not mean that wealthier residents bathed more frequently, rather they were able to put on clean clothes more often. The most common hygiene practice was hand washing. Even in the poorest homes, it was possible to find a basin with a water pitcher or a suspended water cistern with a faucet. The cleanest people were country folk, who would often wash in the stables or the river. The church was generally against bodily cleanliness and so allowed priests or monks to bathe only twice a year, at Christmas and on the feast day of some chosen patrons. In spite of this, there were public baths in each town where people were not just to get clean, but to socialize. Contrary to today's notions, the people of that time were not very prudish, and men and women shared the bathhouse together. Even the urban poor had the right to visit the baths, paid for by the municipality. Jail. Medieval prisons were mainly castle dungeons. Later, different types of strongholds for internment of criminals came into being. Municipal jails located at the town hall or rathouse and separate prisons for debtors. Prisons held both men and women together. Segregation was only based on social status and the severity of the crime. Prison was not intended to serve as a remedial function as nowadays, but rather as a temporary stay for convicts before the execution of their sentence. No one wanted to have to feed prisoners long-term. Liturgical items. The church inventory consisted of liturgical vessels used during services, sculptures, paintings, and wall paintings which presented biblical stories and church regulations in a simple form to the uneducated populace. Pulpit, an elevated space from which the priest preached or readings were delivered. Altar, the place where the sacrifice is performed. It can be main or side, often richly decorated. Ciborium, vessel used to store the consecrated host. Chalice, used for wine, the blood of Christ during communion. Paten, holds the host, body of Christ. Monstrance, ornate vessel used to display the Eucharist, the host. Music. Until the 11th century, music and singing were primarily liturgical, though also associated with everyday activities. In the ecclesiastical world, there were Gregorian chants, taking their name from the Pope Gregory the Great, which were musical forms of Latin singing unaccompanied by instruments used in Roman Catholic ceremonies. The Middle Ages were not adverse to singing, but it was a difficult time for musical instruments, since the church frowned upon any kind of music other than vocal. For centuries, therefore, only ancient instruments were used without any new innovations. Instrumental music in its own right gained prominence only in the 14th century in the Ars Nova or New Art period. The concept of an original musical work or composition was as yet unknown. Music arose mostly from improvisation, and musical works were learned by heart and spread by oral transmission. Noble officials. Hetman, originally a commander in certain armed forces with a rank equivalent to captain. Later on, the role became that of a civic governor, selected from amongst the local nobility who represented the monarch in given territory. Hofmeister, from the German Hof meaning a court or manor, a hereditary office at the royal court, responsible for management of the court. Underchamberlain. Along with the chancellor, the underchamberlain, in Latin subcamerarius, was a member of the office such as the protonotary or notaries, which represented the monarch in royal cities. Burgrave, a representative of the monarch and head of provincial officials of knightly status. His duties included management of the city and leading the army when necessary. Paganism. Pagan traditions persisted in the Czech lands even after the adoption of Christianity, mainly in the form of folk custom and traditions. They included elements from Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic cultures, and the various influences mixed and increasingly adapted to Christianity over time. Some customs remained in their original forms, such as folk superstitions and poems. Others disappeared completely under the pressure of Christian Church. Paganism in Slavic lands survived in the motifs of jewelry and object decorations, in folk healing, or in the form of festivals. The winter and summer solstices, Carnival, Easter, Walpurgis Night, Midsummer, All Souls Day, Advent, and Christmas all mirror original pagan celebrations, but were renamed and their meanings adapted to Christianity. Pilgrimages. Religious pilgrimages were an important part of the Christian world. There were many reasons to embark on a pilgrimage: seeking forgiveness for sins, shortening the stay in purgatory for the pilgrim's soul or that of their loved ones, asking for healing or other divine help, expressing gratitude, or deepening one's piety and devotion. The destinations of pilgrimages were places associated with Christ's presence and activities, or the places of action or rest of saints. The most significant place was the city of Jerusalem and the site of the Holy Sepulchre. In Europe, the most visited places included Rome, the seat of the popes, and associated with the activities of St. Peter, and the city of Santiago de Compostela with the relics of St. James. In the Czech lands, the most important pilgrimage site was Prague, where the relics of several saints rested over time. The most significant being the national patron St. Wenceslas, who was interred in St. Vitus Cathedral. Undertaking a pilgrimage meant enduring a challenging and often dangerous journey, whether by land or partially by sea, and it was considered a significant achievement for the individual. Providing shelter and help to a pilgrim was regarded as a matter of good manners. The development of pilgrimage also had a commercial aspect, especially around pilgrimage sites and travel inns. A pilgrim could often be recognized by their specific attire, which is frequently depicted in various images. This typically included a satchel, cloak, pilgrim staff, pilgrim badges, and the scallop shell of St. James was a common motif or symbol. The scallop shell was a popular item believed to be blessed and thus endowed with supernatural abilities. Such a shell was sometimes placed at the bottom of a well to ensure the purity of the water. Prayers. The oldest prayers were dedicated to the Virgin Mary, e.g. Ave Maria, Hail Mary, the Rosary, and many litanies. The original form of prayers were pagan formulations which were adapted to the new doctrine upon the acceptance of Christianity. In addition to Marian prayers, the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, and the Credo, Creed, and the Angelus were recited and even more frequently sung. Litanies were primarily dedicated to Christ, but also to other saints. The priest would chant, and the people would respond with Kyrie eleison. Monks knew and used many more prayers related to the daily cycle. Hermits and others who devoted themselves to God and solitude recited the Holy Scriptures and Psalms. During the liturgy, Latin was predominantly heard, but there were also prayers or songs in vernacular, e.g. Lord, have mercy on us, or St. Wenceslas. Priests. Priests in medieval society were part of the elite and among the few who had some education. Village priests were not as educated as those from larger parishes. They were not good at reading or writing and did not maintain a library. Instead, they memorized liturgical texts. They were also not very wealthy, often working in fields or raising livestock like other peasants. They did not observe celibacy, engage in folk entertainment and games, danced, and frequented taverns. Lax morals and declining education later appeared in towns and monasteries. In contrast, priests in larger parishes and towns possessed more wealth and did not need to do manual labor except for serving God. The duties of a priest included preparing and conducting Mass, hearing confessions, taking care of the church, its operations and decoration, visiting the poor and sick, organizing collections for charity, collecting taxes, baptisms, weddings, last rites, and funerals. Toilets. In the countryside or during wars, people would relieve themselves in nature, in the barn or in the yard near the dung heap. Higher status homesteads had a small wooden shed built near the dung heap. At night, chamber pots were used, kept under the bed, and emptied onto the dung heap in the morning. In castles and wealthier homes, one could find a privy, a toilet, if possible, located in one of the heated rooms in a bay window on an upper floor. It did not always have doors and was equipped with a seat with a round hole. It was often located directly in the banquet hall, so the user did not have to leave the room and could observe activities at the table from the privy. Privies were typically in a niche carved into the wall, fitted with a slanted chute that opened to the outside of the building. In both cases, feces would freely fall along the castle walls into a moat or down a slope. Over time, privies were modernized and flushed with rainwater. Additionally, additional features were added, such as a flap that released the waste outside, which only opened when stepped on. Despite these advances, it was still common practice until the 16th century to empty chamber pots out of the windows onto the street in cities. Ugh. Baths and bath maids. Wherever hygiene and thus baths were lacking, public baths became popular. Public baths in Central Europe appeared from about the 12th century. Every town had them, often in significant numbers. Sometimes a town would have 3 or 4 bathhouses. Here, people had access to hot water for bathing or steam baths. In those times, steam was produced by pouring water onto heated iron or stones. Body cleanliness was taken care of by male and female bath attendants. Overall, body washing was done in bathtubs, coppered wooden vats, and tanks. In Bohemia, there were baths in operation since the early Middle Ages, and their numbers rose steadily. There were 47 public baths in Prague in the second half of the 14th century, and by the 15th century, the baths were attended not just by the well-to-do, but also by the poorer classes. There was even a regulation that the bath keepers had to open their doors once a quarter to the poor and to students. Bathhouses typically belonged to the municipality and were released to the bath keepers. In addition to the municipal and private baths, there were also private baths in houses of the nobility and wealthy townspeople. In the 13th and 14th century, the bathhouses were very much associated with prostitution. In the 13th century, particularly, bathhouse prostitution became widespread, and there were scarcely any that did not provide sexual services. In the richer urban baths, there would also be pharmacists, masseuses, stokers, and cleaners. In the villages, the bathhouse keeper had to do all of these jobs himself. Executioners. The profession of executioner dates back to the ancient Egypt and Rome. In Europe, it reappeared again in the 13th century. Before that, executions were carried out by judges themselves or prosecutors or relatives of the condemned or other individuals. It was only with the advent of the executioner that all tasks shifted to them. Although executioners made decent money from their profession and having their own executioner was a status symbol for every town, the executioners themselves lived on the fringe of society. Associating with an executioner meant a loss of honor for respectable persons, and the executioner themselves had to face many discriminatory measures, separate place in church and at the inn, exclusion from social events, etc. The executioner was responsible for punishments such as hanging, breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, and torture, as well as quartering and beheading. They had assistants, henchmen, who helped with the preparation and disposal of executed bodies. Other tasks of the executioner included the removal and disposal of dead animals, catching stray dogs, and sometimes even cleaning up filth from the streets. The executioner also sometimes oversaw the city brothel, had partial knowledge of surgery, could treat fractures, reset dislocated limbs, or amputate them in case of gangrene. Sometimes the executioner deceitfully sold items directly related to executions to superstitious people, such as ropes or fingers of the hand or amulets made from their hair. Minstrels and musicians. Theater, as we know it today, was not widespread in Middle Ages and was used more for church purposes, passion plays. Art in the high court, on the other hand, was not comprehensible to commoners, so the profession of folk entertainer was established for a variety of purposes. Minstrels were seen at fairs and markets. They made the rounds of taverns and were even hired by wealthy merchants or nobles. The minstrel's repertoire could include singing, playing musical instruments, juggling, staging scenes, or narrating humorous stories. The theme of their work were mostly light and cheerful, but often included satire or criticism of political conditions, whether coming from the minstrels themselves or paid for by an employer and tailored to their intentions. Most of the minstrels had no employer. They belonged to the margins of society and had to get by from day to day through alms. Musicians enjoyed a bit more respect, and besides entertainment, their music could also be used during religious services. Popular medieval instruments included flutes, trumpets, shawms, as well as lutes, harps, and drums. Their performances were mostly improvised, but early musical notations also began to appear at this time. There were both professional musicians employed at the court or churches and traveling musicians playing in markets and at celebrations. This craft was predominantly pursued by men. Prostitution. Oh my god, look at that photo. In Bohemia, brothels were called Hampage, whorehouse, or house of shame, but not brothel. Prostitutes were simply called whores. The profession encompassed several categories. The most deprived prostitutes were homeless and provided services in the streets. Others visited their customers in their homes, disguised as bread sellers, while others were at hand at a given court. Then were those who offered their services in brothels of various price categories, whose clients were townsmen, officials, and nobles, or conversely, the most vulgar clientele in the cheapest brothels. Brothels were run not only by townspeople, but often by clergy. For example, the parish priest of the Church of St. Giles under Viserad. Often a brothel was directly connected to a bathhouse. During the Hussite Wars, many brothels were abolished, but flourished again afterwards. Legalization was aided by the Roman Catholic Church, which considered prostitution a lesser evil than adultery. It's telling that the prostitutes made up nearly 10% of the population in Papal Rome. There were numerous regulations and laws covering brothels and the oldest profession, as well as a special tax. Laws also covered considerate treatment of prostitutes and protected them from violence. Interesting. I like how they protected prostitutes. All right, now into locations. We have Nabokov. The castle was likely built at the end of the 13th century on a promontory overlooking Nabok Pond, surrounded on all sides by steep cliffs and water. To construct the fortress, the rock beneath it had to be manually hewn away and leveled, which was a relatively complex process for its time, given it was a small noble castle of little significance. According to archaeological research, it had a three-part layout with a courtyard and fortified keep, connected to other parts of the complex by a bridge spanning a rocky moat. The first mention of the castle in historical sources only appeared in 1455. The castle burned down at the end of the 15th century and from 1538 is described as abandoned and in ruins. The ramparts, moats, and notches in the rocks are all that remain of the fortifications today. We endeavored to reconstruct the castle in the game in an appearance that aligns as much as possible with archaeological findings. Trotsky Castle. Trotsky Castle was built around 1380 by Seneck of Wartenberg between two basalt rock formations of a long-extinct volcano. The castle derived its name from the shape of the rock, which resembles the ruins of a collapsed castle. After Seneck's death, the castle passed to King Wenceslas IV, from whom it was acquired by Otto III von Bergov. who is listed as the owner since 1399. Structurally, the castle consists of two landmarks still standing today, the Crone Tower and the Maiden Tower. Between them lies an elongated castle core with two palaces transitioning into a fortified outer bailey on the northern side. The entire castle is rugged and complex. Traversing it requires covering a long distance with elevation changes. Neither of the entrance gates were protected by a moat. It was not necessary, given the other defenses. The gate leads to the eastern part where the three-story residential palace once stood. On the western side, there was a secondary palace, primarily built of wood. On its ground floor was a forge, which was used until the 17th century. Today, the castle is accessible from spring to autumn and is one of the most visited ruins in Bohemia. The ramparts and the gate have been restored, and the lower tower was a viewing platform open to the public with a far-reaching view of the entire Bohemian Paradise region. And this wraps up our third Codex catch-up. I'll do another one a little bit later when I see that they start piling up. We're now in Kuttenberg, so there's a lot that I'm going to be discovered, big areas of the map that we're going to unveil, and maybe new things that we'll learn along the way. And if not, the last one will probably be after the final episode. I don't know when that will be, but I don't want to have to do only 4 or 5 of them. I want a good grouping of them. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you all learned something. I learned quite a bit, and I'll see you on the next episode of either Codex Catch-Up or the Let's Play series. Until then, take care, everyone.